Let's talk about peak oil. So here we see the production curve for the lower 48 states in America. Now, you might have heard of this before, that in 1956, the petroleum geologist M. King Hubbert looked at the pattern of petroleum production and depletion in the lower 48 states of America, and he noticed that peak oil discovery had occurred in 1934, and every single mature well followed the same pattern of rising production initially, a peak in production, and inevitable decline. And he summed these all up, he added them all up, and he made a bold prediction in 1956. He said that America would reach peak oil production in 1970, following which their oil output would inevitably decline, and there's not a darn thing that they could do about it. Now, he at the time was ridiculed, vilified, people called him a fool and idiot, because America was swimming oil at that time, and the optimists said, oh, we'll never run out of oil. But guess what? America reached peak oil in December 1970. There has been an inevitable decline, and they only now have about something like 3% of the world's reserves. Now look at this, this blip in the oil price occurs around 1980, which is the second oil shock because of the Shah of Iran being deposed. Now, the cornucopian delusionist economists say all you need is a price signal and oil output will increase. The same people who say if the price of eggs rise enough, the roosters will start laying. But no, nothing actually happened here. This blip is like 5 years later. This blip comes from the Alaskan oil fields. So despite a dramatic improvement in oil field technology, there was no increased output of petroleum from America despite that massive oil spike and lack of foreign sources. Higher prices do not primarily lead to greater production. Geology is ultimately the limiting factor, and geological realities are clearest after the fact. This brings us to a particular thought. So we know that the 49th state of America is Alaska, the 50th state is Hawaii. Anybody knows the 51st state of America? Beg your pardon? What's the 51st state of America? Anybody? Yes? No? Canada? Not Puerto Rico. The late great author, American author Kurt Vonnegut said that the 51st state of America is a state of denial. So where's the remaining oil to be found? 2/3 of the oil supplies, oil reserves of the world are to be found in the Middle East. Number 1 oil country is of course Saudi Arabia, number 2 Iraq, number 3 Iran, and of course Kuwait has a lot. Eurasia, where's the oil to be found? Mostly around the Caspian Sea. We mentioned Azerbaijan before. Kazakhstan, quite a lot of oil. Some in Uzbekistan. North America, well, as I said, they've gone well past peak oil now, so not a lot to be found in North America. Latin America, Venezuela, of course, immediately comes to mind. But Mexico has considerable supplies of oil as well, and certain equatorial Andes states, Ecuador. What about Africa? Mostly around the Gulf of Guinea. Nigeria, we mentioned, Chad is some. Further south, Angola. Further north, Algeria and Libya. Western Europe, not a lot, mostly North Sea oil which is being depleted. Far East, very little, mostly Indonesia, Brunei. And out of interest, until a couple of years ago, Indonesia was an oil exporting nation. But because of their rising population, 2 years ago they no longer were able to export oil. They're now a net importer. And this bodes badly for the future for us, and I'll explain more about that later. So here's a famous graph which was produced by Colin Campbell, who founded the Oil Depletion Institute in London and latterly the Association for the Study of Peak Oil. And we can see, if we summarize all the trends in oil fields around the world in the same way that M. King Hubbert did for the United States, we get a picture of what's happening in the world. Peak oil discovery occurred in 1965, long time ago. In the year 2000, we were burning something like 4 or 5 barrels of oil for every barrel discovered. In the year 2005, we were burning something like 9 barrels of oil for every barrel discovered. And that's the growing gap. And the gap's going to get bigger and bigger as time goes by. 20 to 1, 50 to 1, 100 to 1. 2003 was the first year in which no oil field larger than 500 million barrels was discovered. 500 million barrels sounds like a large amount. Does anybody know how long 500 million barrels will last the world? Will it last us a year or 3 months? Anybody has any idea how long 500 million barrels will last the world? It lasts us 6 days because we consume something like 85 or 86 million barrels per day. So, the outlook ain't great. I think the watershed period was between 2005-2006 when it became very clear that we had reached the peak of conventional oil production. Cantarell, which is the supergiant oil field in Mexico, crashed. Its output that year dropped by 13%. In a normally depleting oil field, it should only drop by about 3.5% per year. So this is what happens when you try and extract oil as quickly as possible. Yes, you can maintain things for a while, but when it starts to deplete, it really crashes. Again, between 2005-2006, the Kuwaiti oil minister admitted that Bergen, the largest oil field in the world, had gone past peak oil. Saudi oil output diminished by 8%. Now remember, 2005-2006 is well before the global financial crisis when there was an insatiable demand around the world for oil, and yet the oil output from Saudi Arabia still dropped by 8%. To us, that means it definitely has gone past peak oil. Way back in 2004, the oil author Matt Simmons wrote a book called Twilight in the Desert, saying that even then the Saudi operators were using extraordinary measures such as horizontal drilling and injection of saline, injection of carbon dioxide to extract oil, which you only use for depleting fields. And yet they say they have plenty of reserve, they have plenty of spare capacity. They are lying. Why do I keep talking about the giant oil fields? I think we need a bit of perspective and proportion to understand how important these giant oil fields are to us. There are something like 47,500 oil fields around the world. 47,500 oil fields, not oil wells. Of those, something like 507 are the giant and supergiant oil fields, and they provide us with 60% of all our oil. So something like slightly over 1% of the oil fields provide us with 60% of our oil. The other 47,000 provide only 40%. What does this mean? This means that you can find another 10,000 average size oil fields. It doesn't make a darn difference to our oil supply. What we need are giant and supergiant oil fields, and there are no more conventional giant and supergiant oil fields to be found. We'll talk about non-conventional oil later. So let's look at this, because this graph is a little bit out of date. So we'll look at this area right now. What are the up-to-date figures get in the kind of expanded graph here? And so this is what we see, that since late 2005, there has been flat oil output, and we're never going to get beyond 87 million barrels a day. This is as much as it's ever going to be. And I think we have to appreciate that fact. The key problem, the key worry for us is when the output is going to start to decline. We just don't know that. Why is peak oil important? Why did Colin Campbell change his focus from oil depletion to peak oil? It's because the proverbial starts to hit the fan when you reach the peak of oil production. So even the slightest disruptions can have a major effect on oil prices. We saw this amazing spike from around $60 a barrel to, it was actually $147 per barrel. Depends on what type of oil we're talking about. In July 2008, and Peter Newman of Curtin University says that it was peak oil which lit the fuse, which exploded the powder keg of the global financial crisis, because vulnerable people could not afford their day-to-day commodities or transportation and had to give up their mortgages. But once you have a collapse of various industries, then the demand falls and therefore the oil price falls, and fluctuating oil prices is characteristic of a peak oil situation. So I mentioned something about light sweet crude. This is average West Texas Intermediate price. Light sweet crude versus heavy sour crude. When we say heavy, we mean it's very dense, very difficult to extract from the ground, therefore more expensive. Sour because it contains lots of impurities such as sulfur, and therefore more expensive to process. Crude, why crude? Because it shoots out of the ground and chunks bollocks. Yeah, not much of a response there. Anyway, it just shows how conservation-minded I am. I even recycle my worst jokes. So, okay, so International Energy Agency, these figures came from, well, this came from the Energy Information Administration. International Energy Agency has been cited as an authority on oil predictions, but they are masters of 2020 hindsight, but they are hubristic cornucopian delusionists, and they toe the line of the governments that fund them. Back in 2006, the IEA said, this is how much oil we have for the future. So they took the most optimistic projection from that line there. But as the output was sort of tailing off, in 2008 they had to revise it, but they still took the most optimistic possible projection. But really, if you want to be honest and you look at the average, you have to take the flat line here for now. Who are the cornucopian delusionists? And what are their views? They believe that there's plenty of oil remaining. They believe the markets will save us. They believe technology will save us. They are the Cambridge Energy Research Associates, which are basically just public relations firm for the oil companies. The International Energy Administration, the Energy Information Administration, the USGS, United States Geologic Survey, and of course ExxonMobil have been the deniers of peak oil for many, many years. To some degree they still are. But guess what? Last year, ExxonMobil sunk in $600 million for biofuel research. Now, if you really believe there's so much more petroleum out there, why don't you use that money for more prospecting of petroleum? So their actions do not match their words. These people represent vested financial interests who dominate economic activity and government policy. Who are the realists? The realists are concerned that global oil reserves have been grossly overestimated or purposely overstated. The economy may not be able to respond to price signals. The impacts of peak oil will be significant, and peak oil is already here or imminent. I think all the facts have already proven these assertions beyond any shadow of a doubt. The realists are people who have no pecuniary interest in promoting their view, who have looked at data, science. They are hard scientists or people with a strong background in the oil industry. M.K. Hubbard, Kenneth Petraeus, who's an oil geophysicist of Hubbard's vintage, who predicted that peak oil would occur in December 2005. Colin Campbell, I mentioned before, an oil geophysicist who has on-site experience in hundreds of oil wells around the world. Albert Bartlett, a physicist from Colorado. Richard Heinberg, an ecologist from California. John LaHerriere, who wrote the seminal paper on peak oil with Colin Campbell in Scientific American in the 1990s. Jeremy Leggett, more modern-day oil geophysicist, who was so disgusted with the lies that the oil industry were telling that he decided to quit the oil industry and set up a solar energy firm in the UK. T-Bone Pickens, the legendary oil man. And they are the scientists of the Association for the Study of Peak Oil, the German Energy Watch Group, the governments of Sweden and Norway have come to accept that peak oil is real. And Chevron, God bless their oily souls, have also admitted, a few years ago they were just putting out adverts saying, we burnt up 1 trillion barrels of oil and we only have 1 trillion left. hard to get